I think I will just get started then. So welcome to Cardiff BookTalk. This is our first event of the 2021-22 season, so thank you very much for joining us. We're back online to provide you with the book club with a difference. Tonight is a joint event with Cardiff Amnesty International, and our book today is The Optician of Lampedusa by Emma-Jane Kirby. We are so delighted to have the author with us today. So remember, we will invite you to put your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So do find that button, and that's where you can put questions to the author at the end. But do feel free to put them in there at any time. What will happen next is that Emma-Jane will give an introduction to her book and will also present a reading from it. Then Tom Davies will come in and will explain Amnesty's campaigning around refugees. To start the discussion tonight, after Emma-Jane's reading and introduction, Tom will ask one or two questions directed to her, and then we'll open the floor to audience questions too. You know, Cardiff BookTalk is very much about getting you all involved. So we also have Tom Davies here from Cardiff Amnesty International as well. And I just want to say, before we do get started and I give the introductions to all of our panel in a moment, there is an important reminder tonight that as a BBC employee, Emma-Jane must be careful to maintain impartiality when talking about the refugee crisis. So please do avoid asking her questions that might suggest you are inviting her or asking her to break that impartiality, because she can't do that. Let me then introduce the panel today. Emma-Jane Kirby has spent the past 28 years working across BBC news outlets for television, radio, and online. She's made several TV and radio documentaries, including one recorded, and I really want to hear more about this, recorded entirely in zero gravity, 44,000 feet over Moscow. Wow. And in 2001, she began her career as a foreign correspondent, first at Geneva, and first as a Geneva and UN correspondent, and then in Brussels as a Europe correspondent, and moving to France to become Paris correspondent in 2007. On returning to London, she became a reporter for Radio 4's news programmes, PM and The World at One. Throughout her career, migration has been her specialist subject, and she has made many reports from the front line of the migration crisis, from Afghanistan to Bulgaria, and of course, the Mediterranean. She is currently taking a break from the world of fact and is working as a storyliner in Ambridge, which is, of course, the fictional home of Radio 4's long-running soap opera, The Archers. And then also joining Emma-Jane today on the panel is Tom Davies, who is a priority campaign manager for Amnesty International UK, where he has worked for the past 12 years. In that time, he's led campaigns on issues ranging from torture, where he was a member of the Foreign Secretary's Advisory Group on Torture Prevention, freedom of expression in Zimbabwe, and most recently on refugee and asylum rights in the UK. Whilst managing the I Welcome Refugees campaign, calling for a better international response to the global refugee crisis, he also co-chaired the Families Together Coalition and helped establish Football Welcomes as a long-term amnesty project. And from Cardiff, finally, we also have Thomas Owen with us, who is the co-chair of Cardiff Amnesty, and it's been a delight to collaborate with all of you to bring this event, BookTalk and Amnesty, together. Thomas Owen has been focusing on campaigns surrounding detained British Iranian dual nationals in Iran and excessive cellular confinement in UK prisons. As part of this role, he also coordinates the Cardiff Amnesty Human Rights Book Club, and more about what that is and how you can join from Thomas at the end. And in his day job, Thomas works at a charity assisting refugees and asylum seekers. And now to the event. So I'm going to have, without any further ado, hand straight over to Emma-Jane to begin with the reading and an introduction to her book. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you everybody for coming in to listen to The Optician of Lampedusa today, to hear the talk and take part in this event. It's always lovely to do these kind of things, and it's great that we can still do it despite having to do it on Zoom. Of course, it would be nice to be there in person. What I thought I'd do tonight is tell you a little bit about the story behind the book, how it came to be, why I wrote it in the way and in the genre that I did, and then a little bit about the impact that it had and that I hoped it will continue to have. first thing to say, of course, if anybody hasn't read it, it is not a nice story. That's the first thing that the optician himself said to me when I met him. Don't ask me about my story because it is not a nice story. It isn't a fairy tale, but it's a very real and frightening story, a true story, of course, that I hope that I hope everybody will want to hear, and that I think everybody should hear. I first met the optician, Carmine Mena, as he's really called, in 2015 when I was on the migration trail. I'd been covering migration pretty much exclusively for about a year or 18 months. He is a real man on a real island. Lampedusa is, of course, closer to Africa than it is to mainland Italy. And we knew that at the time I was reporting, there had been some sort of compassion fatigue setting in. People were saturated with the migration tale. They were seeing the same images of upturned boats and people in the water and saying, terribly sad, but I've seen it. Hearing the stories of migrants and saying, yeah, I've heard that. I'm pretty sure I've heard that story already. And you would think, as a reporter, you know, good grief, there are so many stories, but unfortunately they were sounding the same because there were so many of them, because so many people were dying in the Mediterranean, so many people were losing their lives and their loved ones. And we thought, how do we try and refocus our audience's mind back at Radio 4 on what is one of the biggest crises and stories of our age? And we decided to flip the story on its head. And instead of interviewing the migrants this time, as I'd been doing for so many months, so many years, we would interview ordinary Italians who were affected by the migration crisis and see if that could steer people back into focusing. And so I did a series of reports on ordinary Italians affected by the crisis. And in the series, we had an absolutely lovely hospital director who had to try and accommodate all those who were hurt, burnt on the boats, who were extremely ill, etc. We had the grave digger of Lampedusa, who had the terrible job of burying those who had not made the crossing. We had a wonderful woman who was a housewife turned soup kitchen director, who turned the soup kitchens for refugees into a big family gathering. We had a carpenter who was an amazing man, a very religious man, who used to take the boats that migrants had washed up in on Lampedusa shores, and he would take the wood from those boats and fashion them into crosses, which he would give to Christian migrants, particularly the Eritreans, for example, who came in to Lampedusa. And he also supplied churches with this wood, which he said smelt of suffering. And then we had the optician. He was the last in our series. And you could ask, well, what place did he have? Because he was just an ordinary man. He was exactly like us, no better, no worse. He was a guy who had a shop. He was an optician. He had his business. He had his sons. He had all his worries about bills, about the rates going up, all his daily little problems to live. And he saw the migrants around him every single day, because in Lampedusa, everybody at that time in 2015 were coming out of the migrant reception centre, and they were allowed to wander Lampedusa. And he would see migrants in the street, he would see them outside his shop, and he would feel pity for them, but he would think, it's not my problem. What can I do? I'm just an optician. It's not my problem. And then one day in October 2015, October the 3rd, 2015, 2013, I beg your pardon, he took a boat with his friends. It was a boat made for 10 maximum, and there were 8 of them, his wife and 6 friends, and they decided to go on a little trip to celebrate the end of summer and just have a long weekend out at sea. And he woke up to what he thought was seagulls screaming. And if I just read you a little bit of the prologue from the book. I can hardly begin to describe to you what I saw as our boat approached the source of that terrible noise. I hardly want to. You won't understand because you weren't there. You won't understand. You see, I thought I heard seagulls screeching, seagulls fighting over a lucky catch. Birds, just birds. We were in open sea after all. It couldn't be anything else. I had never seen so many people in the water. Their limbs were thrashing, hands grasping, fists punching, black faces flashing over, then under the waves, gasping, yelling, choking, screaming. God, the screaming, the pitch of it. The sea boiling and writhing around them as they kicked and lashed out, clinging to each other, grabbing at pieces of driftwood, snatching handfuls of water as they tried to clutch the tops of the breakers. They were in a frenzy of desperation, shrieking at us, trying to attract our attention on the little boat. And they were scattered everywhere. In every direction I turned, my head, there were more of them, hundreds of them, plunging, spluttering, an outstretched arm beating the water, pleading. And my wife, sobbing my name as the propeller of the motorboat cut a jagged, clumsy path through the bodies. They were all drowning. I thought, how do I save them all? The Optician of Lampedusa, of course, couldn't save them all, but on a boat that had a capacity for 10, on which there were already 10, he managed to save with his friends 47 people, and that story completely changed his life. When I did the interview with him, I was very lucky in that the story was picked up and it won the International Bio Prize for war correspondence. And at that event, there was a French publisher who asked if I would think about writing a book about the optician. And I knew that was really all I wanted to do because I had been haunted, just as he was, by his story. He warned me. One of the reasons he didn't want to tell me his story, he said, is because you will be haunted by it. And I had to think about what kind of book I wanted to write. I knew I wasn't going to write a biography. I've told you the Optician of Lampedusa, Cardiff is a very ordinary man. You know, he doesn't have a fascinating backstory. He's just a very, very ordinary guy. And I didn't want to write factual journalism either. It's a story that really lends itself to literature. And the book sort of settled itself really into narrative nonfiction, a nonfiction novel. And I think I wanted to do it for several reasons. First of all, because I think storytelling, telling stories can go deeper than just relaying plain facts. And the book often reads much more like a novel than a journalistic account. That's how it's written. It is written as a novel. But it is Carmine Mena's true story, and every fact that you read in the book is true. The French press, when it came out in France, I remember somebody said that she was reading it and devouring it like a novel. A critic was reading it and devouring it like a novel, and then kept getting shocks, almost of cold water, buckets of cold water thrown over her, as she realized this isn't a story. I can't put this down and say, oh, well, that was nice. That, what a shock, that didn't happen. Because it did happen. And as the optician keeps saying to me, it's still happening. And when I was writing it, actually, I kept getting that shock myself because I would get lost in the writing. And just after I wrote the book, I was sent for work for the PM program to Labanov, a place in Milan, where they are trying to identify the bodies of migrants who wash up off the coast of Italy and Sicily. And they had the 360 people that the optician didn't manage to save. And I was presented with a photo album, the same sort of photo album that you and I have knocking around our house of children and family. They had of all the women, men and children that the optician couldn't save. It was incredibly sobering. I also wanted to write it in the way I did because it wasn't just a story about a dramatic rescue, although of course it is a dramatic rescue. for me, it was a sort of modern day parable, if you like. It was really about the awakening of conscience, of a moral conscience, of a social conscience, political conscience as well to some degree, but I think above all of a humanitarian conscience. And I really wanted Carmini's story, although it is absolutely true, I wanted not to limit it just to his story. So this is the reason I never name him in the book. I always call him the optician, because I wanted him to be an everyman figure. I wanted basically him to represent all of us, for us to imagine what would we do if we had been in that boat, if we had been at the helm. And when I did the story for the PM programme, we had an unprecedented response to that radio programme. People wrote in and said, for the first time, I have seen the migrant crisis, precisely because they could imagine themselves on a holiday and faced with thousands of screaming or hundreds of screaming people in the water. And that's what, again, I really, really wanted to do with the book. And of course, also, the optician is a wonderful metaphor, the man who didn't see, when he is, of course, an optician. And I really wanted us to open our eyes the way that Carmine Mena, the way that his eyes were opened. And the best way to do that was to get behind his glasses, as it were, to put ourselves in the boat with him. And of course, there is that age-old literary device of a man who has lost his way, who is lost at sea, the old man in the boat, loads of Anglo-Saxon wanderers, seafarers who are floating aimlessly. And the optician felt, Carmine Mena felt, that he was also floating aimlessly, and this was his purpose. He went out to sea lost, and he came back with a purpose, understanding his place. I should tell you that we know what happened to the migrants who were not saved. We know what happened from survivors, because although we don't hear from the migrants themselves in the book, and I should say as well that the book was a lot fatter when I first wrote it, because I had several chapters from the voices of the migrants, but I decided in the end to make really huge impact. I needed to drill down and just focus on the optician himself. So I stripped away those chapters, but I hope the migrants' voices come screaming out of every page. I hope that the book does give a voice to the migrants that we don't hear much from in the actual book. But I have met the survivors, the people that Carmine saved, and they tell me that what actually happened was they were so close to the shore of Lampedusa, they could actually see the taillights of the traffic going round the island. They could see those red lights, and they all shouted, and the women and children came up above deck, and everybody was cheering. And they stopped the engines and they lit a flare to try and attract attention, so that normally the Coast Guard would then come out and rescue them. And the women and children at that point, because they were so close to Europe's shores, they knew that not everybody would have a wonderful time and a job and a happy new life. They thought only the best presented would. So to start for their new life, they all went down under deck to dress up, to change their clothes, to wash, to put the children in their best clothes so that they would be presentable for their new life in Europe. And they lit a second flare and they couldn't light it, so they poured petrol onto the flare, but it had dripped alongside the boat. And all the men at this point were up on deck. And when the flare got lit, the petrol, unfortunately, on the deck also went up, and everybody ran from that side of the deck to the other side of the deck, and the boat just waited and tipped over. And all the men were thrown into the sea, and the women and children were below deck. And Anybody who has read the book will know that there was only one woman the optician saved. There was only one woman survivor, no children. But it is quite a sobering fact, I think, to realise that they could see their life, their hopes, their dreams, less than a kilometre from Europe's shores. I think through the optician, I'm hoping, again, as I say, that although the migrants aren't actually present in terms of chapters, I'm hoping that they do really, really become alive, because for the optician of Lampedusa himself, the migrants had been just names, just headlines. That's what they were, just names and headlines, and he felt terrible reading stories of drownings. But he said to me it wasn't until he reached for that first hand and he felt that first hand of the drowning migrant lock into his, and he felt sinew on sinew, bone on bone, that he realised these are real human beings. These are real people. Their names, not numbers, he said, but their names. And I remember when I talked to him at length for the book and for interviews, he told me that he had never felt so much alive as when he had gone to the air hangar to witness all the coffins of the people he was unable to save. And he said he'd never felt so alive and so sad in his life when he realised all the families and every individual who represented so many thousands of other individuals who had also tried for a new life, tried to get out of persecution, out of poverty, out of political instability, out of war, and they were lined up in front of him. The book, I was very lucky, was chosen by Waterstones to become their book of the month in November 2016, and it was runner-up for their book of the year. And there was a campaign that some of the sales went to Oxfam. And so Oxfam, I can't remember, I know in the first couple of months of the promotion, I think or first month rather of the promotion, I think there was £60,000 was raised for Oxfam, which was fantastic. The same month, the Financial Times very kindly voted the book as one of its top political books of the year, which was a surprise in many ways, because to me the book, of course, it's political in so many ways, but in other ways I wanted it to be apolitical. You know, we never find out how the optician votes. We don't know whether he votes left or right. I still don't actually know to this day how the optician of Lampedusa, how Carmine Mena votes. There is no moral to the parable either. You know, there is no Hollywood ending for this book. Carmine Mena doesn't become a preacher. He doesn't discover Jesus. He doesn't throw up his old life as an optician and go and work for Amnesty or go and work for UNHCR or go and work for Oxfam or an NGO. You know, he just picked up his old life and returned to work, albeit with his eyes wide open. And I think really that's the message that I was trying to give in the book, and Carmine Mena wanted me to give in this book, that your views on politics don't really matter. Your views on immigration don't really matter, whether you are pro or anti immigration. The message really is just open your eyes. Who can accept, who can close their eyes to the fact that so many thousands of people are losing their lives on Europe's doorstep? And I think, you know, Carmine Mena, the only time we've ever had a cross word is when I once called him a hero. And he said, I am no hero. A hero would have saved them all. He was very, very cross about that. And he just kept saying to me, I am just an optician. And he is a very, very shy man. He didn't want to do the interview at all. But when I asked him to do the book, he immediately said yes, because he loved reading and because he wanted the message that he'd learnt to go further. Open your eyes. And I think, you know, again, to come back to that lovely literary conceit of an optician who doesn't see, he had his eyes open. He wants us, that is his job as an optician, to see clearly. And that's why he agreed for this book to go ahead. And if I can just end the talk today before we take lots of questions, I hope, by taking us back to the words that his final words in his interview that he gave me. The interview, which, by the way, you can still look at if you Google BBC PM optician and my name, you'll find the whole series that I did from Lampedusa and from Sicily. But he ended his interview by saying, this isn't a nice story, it's a haunting one, but we should be haunted by it because it's still happening. What can we do? We have to look into our consciences and think.
Thank you very much, Emma-Jane. I'll clap here. I'm sure other people at home will be clapping. That was very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. Thank you very much. Personally, I loved the book. I thought it was a brilliant book. It's not a nice story, as you say, because of the tragedy of it. But I really like the way it dealt with a very serious issue in a very human way. Sadly, it's very current and topical still now. I think all the issues that are in that book. But I love the way that the central characters, not just the optician, but the central characters, how that tragic incident led to, I think the phrase, did you use the phrase awakening of consciousness? But I made a note before of just that increased awareness and concern for people fleeing conflict and persecution, how that moment jolted them and shook their world and kind of opened their eyes to all these issues, including some quite big, like, structural issues, really, like how European countries responded then and continue to respond now to the global refugee crisis. Some of those push factors that lead people to flee their home, to leave everything behind. So in this case, Eritrea, but there are countless other countries that could equally apply to. But also the power imbalances between the state and the individual, and obviously that's most stark for the survivors of the tragedy. But it's also for the Italian citizens when they try and visit the people whose lives they have literally saved. They realize they have no power in that situation. And so there are a lot of overlaps for Amnesty International and Amnesty supporters, and I'm sure there are many Amnesty supporters on the call now who will, a lot of this will resonate. So just for me, I'll speak for about 10 minutes or so, just to give a bit of context for some of the issues that are covered in the book, and then I'll ask Emma-Jane a question or two, and then we'll open up for everyone else to ask their questions. So I'll also talk a little bit about the UK context right now, because I'm sure people are familiar with or have heard of the Nationality and Borders Bill, which is currently going through Parliament, which is deeply concerning for Amnesty and many others. But let's start off maybe by going back around 75 years. World War II has just ended. And all the horrors that go with it. There's peace, but amongst other things, huge numbers of people are displaced. They've been uprooted. They've fled their homes and are now in a new country that they're calling home. So it's at this point that the world came together to say, never again, enough is enough, and to create the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR. So that is where the right to asylum from persecution was enshrined as a human right in that UDHR. It was strengthened with a convention in 1951 called the Refugee Convention, where essentially if to be recognised as a refugee, if you have a well-founded fear of persecution and you are outside of your home country, then you have that right to seek asylum. Essentially, if it's too dangerous for you to go home, then you have a right to claim asylum. And it's a right that's that goes back decades. That 1951 Refugee Convention, the UK was among the core group of states that drafted that convention. And the UNHCR, which Emma-Jane just made a reference to, is the UN agency for refugees, and it's the guardian of that convention. I'll come back to that, to the UNHCR in a second. So at Amnesty, we've worked for the protection and the promotion of refugee rights and for people seeking asylum for decades, and we're continuing to do that. In recent years, we've globally, and we've got offices in around 70 countries, we've prioritized campaigning for refugee rights and for the international community to better share responsibility for responding to the global refugee crisis. I don't know how long you can keep calling it a crisis when sadly it's going on year on year, but it's worth noting though that 86% of the world's refugees live in developing countries. So that's 14% in the richer countries of the world. And 73% of the world's refugees are hosted in neighboring countries to conflict zones, or where there might be a dictator or whatever it is that somebody's had to flee from. So those two statistics alone for me demonstrate how richer countries such as the UK and our European neighbours are really not sharing responsibility equally. And Amnesty's campaigning takes many forms, from specific pieces of Home Office policy that could be changed to enable more refugees, people recognised as refugees in the UK, to be reunited with loved ones who are currently, close family who are currently unable to join them. To also working on trying to, encourage the government to move faster, to relocate, to bring people from Afghanistan to the UK to be safe, as a commitment has been made there. But also working on issues very relevant to this book that criminalizes acts of solidarity with refugees. There's a case in Greece that's going to go to the court soon. Two individuals, Sarah Mardini and Sean Binder, they volunteered as rescue workers in Lesbos, and they were arrested for it and faced trial accused of spying, people smuggling, and belonging to a criminal organisation. And if convicted, they could face up to 25 years in prison. But there's also work that I'm sure many of the Amnesty supporters in Cardiff or across the UK on this call have been involved with, which is simply trying to create a more welcoming environment in our communities for people who have had to flee and are rebuilding their lives here in the UK. And that issue of criminalisation of solidarity is something, sadly, that we could see in the UK in the not too distant future. So right now we're faced with a huge challenge here. The Home Office is proposing changes to the UK's immigration and asylum systems, which are deeply, deeply concerning for Amnesty. I mentioned it before, the Nationality and Borders Bill. It's currently in Parliament. It was being scrutinised by a committee just today. It's a really cruel piece of legislation, and if it passes in its current form, it would largely shut down the UK's asylum system, and it could criminalise people for trying to reach a place of safety. Not everything in the bill is bad, I have to stress. There are some changes which would address historical injustices with British nationality law, but that's around 10% of this bill. The vast majority of it is really, really concerning, and Amnesty's very strongly opposed to it. Essentially, the government's trying to unilaterally redraw those internationally agreed refugee protections by redefining the meaning of the 1951 Refugee Convention, both in terms of who it applies to and how a person is treated when they might make it to the UK. And the impact of that is there's a risk of prosecution and imprisonment if people arrive through an unauthorized route, as you saw in the book. But this is big, and this is a big thing to stress. There are no visas available for the purpose of seeking asylum. So no one can legally come to the UK specifically for the purpose of seeking asylum because they have concerns about their safety. And yet, if someone comes through what's known as an irregular route, then they could be criminalised for that. There's also the risk of these life-threatening pushbacks at sea if people attempt to cross the channel. We've heard about that in the media recently, and it's again relevant to this book. And there are other barriers, additionally, for establishing refugee status in the UK and the right to remain here. And it means that some refugees, for example, those that travel independently, will be discriminated against and disadvantaged compared to others, creating different tiers of protection here. And this, again, linking back to the book, there could be further penalties and exclusions which could have a major impact on the experiences of refugees. So, for example, an increased use by the UK government of detention and other accommodation centres, which could leave people isolated and separated from local communities. And this bill proposes to make a crime a simple, basic act of humanity, that of assisting people who are fleeing war and persecution, if it helps them reach safety here in the UK. You probably heard quite a lot of attention about that in the summer with regards to the possible impacts on the RNLI. I said I'd come back to the UNHCR. The government claims that this bill will fulfil all the UK's international obligations, including that 1951 Refugee Convention. We believe that instead, the bill undermines several international obligations under that convention and other international laws, including the duties to protect life at sea and to provide stateless children with citizenship. And the UNHCR, who are literally the guardians of that 1951 convention, have similar concerns. So there's some context. I'm going to add one more thing before I come back to some questions for Emma-Jane, which is just, that's an overview of what's happening with this bill in the UK. Now, there's a very, very strong chance that the government will be able to push this bill through, and hopefully we and Amnesty and other partners will be able to campaign really strongly to make some changes. But in terms of how the Home Office is approaching this legislation, there was it was introduced after a 6-week public consultation. At Amnesty, we considered not engaging with it because we felt it was not fit for purpose. It was incredibly complicated, it was incredibly hard, it was really rigid in terms of be able to give any kind of nuanced answers. But we felt it was important that organisations like ourselves and members of the public took part, because it was the one opportunity that the government was giving members of the public to respond, and we were concerned that if the public didn't respond, or if the only people responded who were supportive of these changes, then the government would use this to justify and to support this bill when it came to Parliament with MPs, journalists, etc. So we didn't want to give the Home Office a chance of doing that. But also the proposed changes were so concerning that we felt we had to try and generate some opposition. So just firstly, thank you to anyone on the call that did take part in that. I know a lot of Amnesty supporters did. And logically, you would think that if the government ran a consultation on a possible new law, the responses from that would be incorporated, the feedback would be incorporated and analysed for that new law when it be introduced to Parliament. And you'd certainly hope that when MPs had a chance to debate it, that could be informed by the responses to the public to that consultation. But I think you've probably guessed the ending to this little bit of additional context. The Home Office published the responses to that consultation 2 days after MPs finished debating it. They had the initial chance to debate it back in July. And on the very afternoon that MPs were finishing off before heading off on their summer break, the summer recess. And the reason for that's clear. Around 75% of those people who responded to the consultation opposed the changes. So in other words, the Home Office set up a consultation seeking the views of the public, made it incredibly difficult to do so. But when people did, the Home Office decided to ignore that input from the public, not share it with MPs when it would be most useful to them, and plough on with introducing this bill. But that's not the big story. The big story really is the damage that the bill will do and the consequence it will have, not just here in the UK, but how it could open the doors for other countries who may also be seeking to dismantle the global refugee protection system, which has saved countless lives over the last 70 years. I'll stop there. Emma-Jane, if you're there, I'd like to bring you back in if that's possible. I thought I'd ask a couple of questions first, and then we'll open up. And I haven't opened the Q&A or the chat yet, but I'm hoping that the fact that they're red on my screen means that there are some questions that have come in. I thought maybe we could start off with, so I just referenced people being isolated in the UK and in like immigration detention centres. There's a line on page 55 in the book, which I'll read. It's where a policeman says, "I don't care who you are, you can't come in here and you can't talk to the illegal immigrants." And it really stood out for me as being particularly dehumanizing. And I also took it that the policeman was essentially maintaining a policy of keeping those people who had survived that shipwreck separated from the local community, and how using labels such as illegal immigrants can maintain that dehumanization, that lack of humanity towards people. And I wondered, in your many years of being a journalist in many contexts, if you can share any reflections you have on the power of language, and how labels in particular and language in particular can shape narratives which can be both positive and negative.
Absolutely. Yeah. Language is just so important. It can be so inflammatory. Before I answer your question, I should say that the policeman in the book, of course, this happened in 2013, before migrants were allowed out. In the reception centre, a lot of them were coming out, and they did mix a lot with the local population. And I should say that a lot of the police there were fantastic with them and were helping and volunteering as well. But language and the way we use it to tell stories, I think it has a huge power in shaping human response. I should clarify just a BBC thing. We use the term migrant. That's what we're asked to use. We don't say a person seeking asylum seeker, displaced person. We have the term migrant rather than refugee. We don't start using the term refugee until somebody starts an asylum process and is given refugee status. That is just a rule. So please don't read anything into the fact that I use the term migrant. I do think media outlets, whoever they are, including the BBC, have a huge responsibility in how they report the crisis, the ongoing crisis. We have to be so careful of emotive language. We all can remember the terms floods of migrants, a swarm of migrants. We have more, as you've already referenced, more displaced people now in the world than since the Second World War, about 22 million people seeking refugee status in other countries. But as you have said, almost 90% of those are in developing countries, often next door to their own countries. You know, the flood is not coming our way. You know, the large burden is not by wealthy European countries. I also think we have to be incredibly careful about what we film as well. We often film migrants in migrant camps sitting around twiddling their thumbs, and people have said to me, but they don't do anything, they're so lazy. There is a total ignorance that we need to keep explaining, that you cannot, in an asylum process, work. You're not allowed to work. And that most people who go through the asylum process will be in a camp for more than 5 years. 80% of the migrants who are in camps at the moment have been there for more than 5 years. Some of the people that Carmine Mena rescued, for example, in 2013, they were still in 2019, still waiting for their refugee status to be processed in Sweden. They still couldn't work, and all they wanted to do was work. I'm also very nervous about, across media outlets, about reporting from the Channel and going out migrant boat spotting. It is not a sport. desperate people at sea, I think we just have to be extraordinarily careful. It puts reporters in a dangerous position as well, of what they can and can't do. The laws at sea, if somebody's in trouble, you help them. You don't stick a microphone out, obviously. And I think it puts us in very difficult situations. I think also the last thing I'd say is migrants are told, migrant tales, migrant stories are told almost exclusively in a negative register. They're often told in a register of misery. One of the things that I have enjoyed doing so much as a reporter was a series of reports I did from Middlesbrough following a group of refugee doctors and pharmacists and medical practitioners. And this charity in Middlesbrough, along with the NHS Trust, helps to retrain them, get their language skills back up, and helps them pass their English exam, helps them get jobs in the NHS. And it's just wonderful to show a positive story. And we need more positive stories, I think. If I can just add one more thing, I'm as guilty as anybody else of, and I have reported for so many years this crisis, I'm as guilty of meeting new migrants, feeling pity, feeling, a migrant is a migrant, and losing really, the focus on, as the optician realised, that these are real people exactly like us, with the same concerns. They just come from somewhere else. And it really smacked me in the face once when I was in Calais following a group of Syrians. There's a tremendous chap who's a chemical engineer who was desperately trying to get to Britain. He never made it. And we were talking about his bid to try and get across, his life back in Syria, and everything has been destroyed. And a message came through on my telephone from a carpenter who was building these bookshelves, and he sent a photograph. And I said to this chap, Kamal, look, these are my bookshelves I'm having built. And he said, oh, they're great. And he got out his phone and he showed me his bookcases, which he had hand built himself in his beautiful house in Syria. And he said, I noticed, by the way, in your bag, you're reading a Dickens. What's your favourite Dickens? And I said, oh, it has to be Bleak House. And he said, oh, come on, that's never the best Dickens. Come on, it's Little Dorrit. And we argued about which was the best Dickens. And of course, that's who this man was. He was a very educated man who had to flee his home, who had lost everything and was sleeping on the church steps. But he was still a man with bookshelves packed full of books, who read far more than I did.
Thank you. That's lovely to hear. I'll ask one more, and then I'll open up. But there are a couple of questions in the chat, in the Q&A. And I know, and Anna said this at the beginning, I know you're employed by the BBC, very aware of that. You have to maintain impartiality. But you did include a number of references in the book to both Italy and the international community. We're talking about the EU, really failing in their responsibilities to protect refugees. And I pulled out a couple of examples. One was on page 36, where the character Gabriel, I'm not sure how it was written, but felt the fury surge up in him again. How could it be possible that Italy put the law above human lives? And then the optician himself on page 61, a little bit later, said, and this is something you've just referred to, I'm not a damned hero, he thought. I failed. We've all failed. US, Italy, Europe, all of us. And so I wondered, was it intentional to have a message in the book that you wanted the reader to come away with?
Obviously, as a journalist, I can't give my personal opinions on what I think is wrong with the asylum process across Europe or globally. But I think, everybody would agree that it's broken. It is not fit for purpose. And of course, that is what the optician, it is of course the optician's voice through the book, that is what the optician learned. How can this be happening? And it doesn't just happen in Italy, that migrants are failed to be processed correctly. It happens in Britain, in Jordan, Australia, America, Kenya, that governments are turning away migrants without properly assessing their claims, just turning them away from borders. And I think what I really wanted to do, again, you know, I will say again, as a journalist, all I can do is point out to people, point things out. I can say, look over here, look. As a writer, obviously, you can do a little bit more than that, which is, of course, what I was doing with the book, and trying to prick our collective conscience, as it were. And what I really wanted to do, I think, was to show that we can't all go out, obviously, in boats. We can't all be like the RNLI and try and, you know, scour the waves looking for people in trouble. But this crisis, which is one of the biggest of our age, is really a global responsibility. And the wonderful thing is that many people, since reading the book, have written to me and said, I've taken away the message that I can't shut my eyes to it, that I can't say, okay, I can't make the changes, but I could join a group which puts pressure on governments. I can lobby my MP, or if that's not my thing, I can volunteer to teach English to asylum seekers. I can raise cash at a jumble sale for Afghan families who are just joining us in the UK. And so many people have said that they have found their own way of answering the opticians' plea for something to be done. And whatever we do, however small it is, you know, we are reaching out our hand. And I think that's what I wanted to do with the book, to say to people, come on, are you going to reach out your hand? Because what you should know is that while the optician was flailing around in the water among the migrants, desperately trying to rescue them, there were boats that just went past and didn't stop.
Thank you. Just made a note. It just brought back some memories of meeting the Amnesty group in I think it was Saffron Walden about 5 years ago, around the time that there was you know, a lot of people traveling into Europe. But as I think it's clear, there was never a European refugee crisis. There was a global issue, and some people made it to Europe, and even far fewer made it to the UK. But it was a shopkeeper in Saffron Walden who was collecting, this is pre-plastic bags becoming, you know, something that you had to pay for. And then so there's positives about where we are now, but back then when plastic bags were more commonly just handed out willy-nilly, it was a shopkeeper who collected plastic bags from the local shops, from the bags that clothes had come in and whatever it might be that she was selling. And she was hand knitting these plastic bags into about 400 of them to make a plastic roll mat, basically a sleeping roll mat, that she was then arranging to be taken down to Calais when you know, when people were doing that journey, and to support people in Calais. So I mean, the creativity in which you know, people from across the world, but across the UK respond to that situation is really quite inspiring. I'm going to open up the questions to the floor now. The first one we have has come from Elaine, who's in the Amnesty Cardiff group. And she said that she has a vivid recollection of the interviews you and Eddie Mair did from Lampedusa, some of the best radio ever. Thank you. Have you had a chance to revisit the island and its inhabitants since the book was published, and what has happened?
Well, thank you very, very much, Elaine, for listening to those pieces and for your kind words about them. I have been back many a time, and I still see Carmen Jimena, and he always asks me the first thing, quite a naive question, why is it still happening? That's the first thing he asks me, why is it still happening? I was incredibly lucky that on one of the anniversaries of October the 3rd, he invited me onto the boat, onto Galeta, I think we called it in the book. It's actually called something else, but to protect its identity, we called it Galeta. And he had some of those that he rescued on board with him, and most of the crew. And it was a rule that obviously I didn't come with anything to film or to record or to photograph. I just came on as a human being, and the migrants were happy for me to come. And we went out to sea, to the spot, and it's shameful, actually. It really is shameful, the little distance that you have to chug out until you get to the spot, where the boat is still on the ocean floor, by the way. It's still on the seabed. It has not been raised. And they held a little ceremony for their brothers and sisters who died, and the children who died. And it, I think, was one of the most moving, meaningful moments of my life, to be a part of that, to be allowed to stand among them. And the optician is, he still is very much involved in a very low level way. He's not somebody who likes to shout about this, but he is still in contact with all of those, or most of those, that he saved. He follows some of them in Sweden, and in fact they pay him, and the guy who was the boat driver actually pay for some of the migrants, the first ones that he rescued, to come back every year, which is how I met them. And I should tell you that I think I said that the optician only managed to save one woman. That's true, but there were 3 who were rescued. And I met some of the other people that when I was last back in Lampedusa, and one of those was a man who the optician hadn't rescued, but a local fisherman had rescued. And the fisherman had come afterwards. He'd heard the Mayday call and he'd come afterwards. And so he was largely picking up corpses. He only picked up a very, very few survivors. And one of the chap that I was talking to, the survivor that he'd picked up, the fisherman had picked up, saw his cousin, female cousin, floating in the water, face down, and said, "Please, please, that's my cousin. Please pick her up." And he said, "We have to look for other survivors first. We can't." And he said, "Please pick her up." And he did, picked up and put her on a pile of corpses. And when they came back into Lampedusa, the doctor of Lampedusa, who is no longer a doctor, he became an MEP to try and do something. He went through the corpses to prepare for autopsy, and he noticed that woman was still breathing, and he brought her round. He saved her life, and when I met her, she was pregnant. So incredible stories still coming out of Lampedusa, incredible story to be part of, but the detention centre now is, when I was last there, it is closed, it is locked. You can't go there anymore. You can't go and visit. The migrants can't come out. They can't go to the churches. It's a different place.
Thank you. There's another question. The next question that came in was about how long did it take to write the book? Straightforward question for you.
It's a very good question, but never do it. I had to take, I could only take a few weeks off work. So I wrote for 15 hours a day for 7 weeks. Never do it. Never do it like that. I was on a deadline for a publisher, the French publisher, and I did actually, I herniated a disc in my back from being over the laptop for so long. Never write like that. But in a way, it was a good way to write, because of course I was totally and utterly immersed in the writing, and much as I was haunted by the story, I was also sort of followed around everywhere by the optician in my head. I couldn't take a shower without the optician being there. It was a story you couldn't get away from. As I researched more and more, I found so many shocking details, one of which, as I say, please remember that all the facts in the book are true, and that a Lampedusa diver told us that when he dived down into the wreck to pull out the women and children who never stood a chance of survival, he pulled out children who were in brand new patent leather shoes because, as I told you, their mothers had wanted them to look smart for their arrival in Europe. And he pulled out one hand, he pulled one hand from a cabin, and the people came like a sort of Christmas paper chain, all holding hands together. They concertinaed out because they knew that they were drowning, and they'd all held hands at the last moment. And these are pitiful details, but I think they're horrible details that we don't want to remember, but we need to, so that we can really understand that we must not close our eyes to this continuing tragedy.
No, absolutely not. There's another question which you might not be able to answer, Emma-Jane, but if not, then I'm happy to come in, which is, refugees fleeing persecution aside, do we need to accept that it is a fact of the human condition that so long as there are societies that provide better standards of living than others, humans will always attempt to reach those societies? The migrant crises can never be solved, only made safer. Do you agree?
I think that probably is one for you, Tom, to answer, because economic migrants, etc., is a difficult topic for me to give my own opinion on. So if you don't mind,
that's fine. No, of course. No, and I think just to say that the key thing for an organisation like Amnesty International is that where there are internationally agreed protections, like, for example, the 1951 Refugee Convention, that countries that have signed up to that, which is basically all countries in the world, should respect it and not try to undermine it, not try to renege on commitments. And where it's about sharing responsibility for protecting refugees, that countries do that, and countries don't try to build metaphorical or physical walls to just try and keep people out as if it's not my problem. The UK is very good at presenting to the UK government is very good at presenting to the UK public how terrible it is that there's so many people trying to reach the UK. But the numbers of people claiming asylum here have not really increased in the last couple of years. They've been quite stable. They're far, far lower than they were 20 years ago. And they're far, far lower than a country like France or a country like Germany. So Germany has 4 times as many people last year, 2020, 4 times as many people through the UK, through their asylum system as the UK, and France had 3 times as many. But that's not the impression you would get. So yeah, I think when it comes to refugee protection, we're deeply concerned about the direction. That's not just this government. It's not political to this government at all. It's been a direction of travel, sadly, for a number of years to try to not share responsibility for refugees globally. But it's just sadly being turbocharged, if you like, through this Nationality and Borders Bill, which many of the policies have been tried before. Many of them have not been successful or been unimplementable, but they're seemingly all being brought together in this one piece of legislation. And Amnesty and Amnesty supporters are trying our best to try to prevent the worst aspects of this bill. I think that's probably about the most realistic way of presenting it, sadly. So working with parliamentarians to try to have amendments to try to change some of the proposals for the better. I think that's really, I think, all I've got to say on that question. There's another question that's quite simple, I hope, which is the book available from Waterstones?
Yes, it is available from Waterstones. It should be available from Waterstones, since they were extremely good and made it their book of the month, and it was runner-up or in top 5 books of 2016. So I'm sure that it should be still available. Just to come back to that, in fact, I know it is because I saw it in a window the other day, certainly down here in London. Just to come back to the other question, obviously being careful about what I can say, you know, is our only hope to make it safer rather than to stop migration? I don't think realistically we're ever going to stop the flow of migration, and that's why we do need some kind of accord, some kind of system which does work, where everybody can agree what those rules are. I mean, climate change is obviously going to mean that we will see much more migration, and we should remember that, of course, you know, when the convention was set up, it was set up talking about persecution because of sexuality, because of ethnicity, because of religion, faith, political views. But the main reason that people are migrating is, of course, the instability of states. And as long as we have war, as long as we have things like the Taliban taking over in Afghanistan, there is only going to be more migration. And it is obviously there does need to be more engaged ways of trying to find some kind of framework. I mean, if you think about what happened in Italy after the Lampedusa crisis, people were so shocked that Mare Nostrum, the search and rescue vessels, took to the seas, and they asked for financial help from their European partners and didn't get any, which is why Mare Nostrum stopped, because there is no desire to burden share, but there has to be, because as the question points out, you know, it's not going to stop. Climate change is going to drive more people to leave sub-Saharan Africa. War is going to lead more people to leave as well. So,
thank you. We have another question related to more of your current role, Emma-Jane, which is, might we see a migrant story in Ambridge soon? It could help get rid of some of the complacency of long-standing characters.
Believe me, I am trying. Believe me, I'm trying. Obviously, it's far more than my job's worth to tell you what happens in Ambridge. Not allowed to do that. But don't forget, storylines take a very long time. We're actually writing 3 months in advance of what you're hearing out, which is going 10 to 12 weeks anyway, of what's going on air. But let's just say I have an agenda and I will be battling away.
Thank you. And there are other, you know, other places where placing these kind of stories can help in terms of just seeping into the national consciousness, some of that humanity. I remember a colleague from a partner organisation working on, I think, getting a story into Casualty a few years ago. Like you said, it took a long time in the negotiation in the first place, and then the filming, and then a long time before the story then went live. Just while I wait for some more questions to come in, I wouldn't mind asking another one if that's okay. I imagine the experience of being a correspondent reporting on events in the Mediterranean, like that's led to this book, but also Afghanistan and other places, has also led you to have some kind of a personal journey on these kind of issues and the issues covered in the book. If that's the case, could you share how these experiences have moved you? And you're on mute, sorry.
Yes, there we are. I think I make no bones about the fact that I do get extremely moved by the people I've met, the things I've seen, and I challenge anybody to look at, you know, a tiny row of body bags, of tiny little body bags of small children, and not shed a tear. Now, obviously, I try not to show that on air. Nobody wants to see their correspondent on the 10 o'clock news crying. You know, it doesn't help anybody. It's not professional. But I do cry a lot when I'm, you know, off air. And I think that's right, to be honest. I always say the day that I stop being moved by these kind of stories is the day I should stop being a journalist, the day that anyone should stop being a journalist, because I think, this is, if you become immune to human suffering, you can't tell anybody's story. I think you no longer understand them. I mean, I can tell you so many stories of people I've met who I've just been blown away, with, and people who I think about, and some of whom I'm still in contact with. I think one of the stories that has moved me most was when I was in Sicily. I was helping a family. We just finished a big filming session out, and we were in Catania station. We were about to leave, and there was a lady there who was by herself with 4 small children, and she'd just come off a boat. She'd been at sea for goodness knows how long. The children were sick, she was sick, and we were trying to help them, and it was a Sunday, there was nothing open. And we managed to get them some bananas and yogurts, and the children got something to eat. And actually, these children had open heart surgery. They showed us their scars, and the scars were quite fresh. They weren't, particularly well healed. And this poor lady we'd seen her being accosted by a trafficker who was trying to get thousands of dollars out of her to get on a bus to Milan, where she wanted to go. And she had every right to go there, but he was trying to explain that he was trying to convince her she didn't. And I'd been working with a fabulous woman who was known as SOS Syria. She spoke so many Arabic dialects that the migrants had her on speed dial on their phone. And she came and she sorted them out. And the children, as a thank you, drew us these pictures. They were so nicely brought up, bless them. As soon as they'd stopped vomiting, they got out pens and papers and drew all of us thank you pictures. And I said to SOS Syria, when we'd seen the lady and the children safely on the bus for $10, I said, this is incredibly moving. You must just crumble. And she said, this is nothing. The most poignant thing I've ever been given is this. And she just held out a bunch of keys, front door keys, just kind of keys that you and I have, no different. And she said she had helped a man last year who had lost everything in Homs. His house had been bombed, and inside it was his mother, his wife, his 3 children, his sister, and his brother. He had lost every relative he had, and obviously he had nothing. And he had fled, and she had helped him in Sicily when he'd come. And to thank her, he said to her, I wish I could invite you to my house. I wish I could give you food at my table, because if you'd come to my house, you would have walked up my street, you would have heard the laughter, you would have smelt the smells of my mother cooking and my wife cooking, because they were amazing cooks. My children were always laughing. My brother told loads of jokes. You would have come in the door and you would have felt it to be warm, and you would have been welcome. He said, unfortunately, I don't have any of those people anymore. I don't have the house. I don't even have the front door to open. He said, these are my keys. They were the keys to all my happiness. And he gave the keys to the woman who had helped him. And I just think that's such an amazing story. I'm telling it now, I'm getting very emotional. I actually told that story at a Penguin launch, and I've just forgotten his name, Grayson Perry. I made Grayson Perry cry telling that story. But it's, I come across those kind of stories all the time, and it just makes you remember human beings. These, they're not names, as the optician says. Sorry, not numbers. They're names. They're people.
Thank you. There's a question which is referring to one of your answers earlier about, I think it was in Middlesbrough, saying, thank you for a really great talk. Could I ask what the name of the medical charity getting refugee doctors into the NHS was? My wife is an NHS consultant, and we wonder if this could be something that we could expand to Wales too?
Absolutely, and I have just this second gone blank, but I can Google it somehow if I can find some way. I've just Bini Arias is the guy who runs part of that charity, but it's the Middlesbrough Hospital Trust, which is North Tees, I think. But if I quickly probably find it, because I should be able to find my original piece, and I can tell you. I did do something on I followed one of the Eritreans who's unable to work. Unfortunately, it's quite difficult for the GMC to understand sometimes the difficulties that doctors have to take all their papers with them and prove they are qualified. And the poor Eritreans couldn't get verification from the authorities that they were indeed qualified doctors. So the charity, if you look at investing in people and culture, and it's the North Tees and Hartlepool NHS Trust. And if you just Google again, my name, Middlesbrough refugee doctors, you'll find quite a lot out about it. But they were desperate to help during the COVID crisis, and just, they said, we would so happily put ourselves on the line, do anything. We don't mind what we do. We would just drive the ambulances. We would hand out masks. We're not asking to, we can all intubate people, but we're not asking to do that. Just let us be there and hand out the sandwiches, but let us be there. As I said, right at the beginning, everybody wants to work. Do get in contact with them, because it's tremendous. I think they've got about 60 or 70 people at the moment on their books that they're trying to get through the very tough TEFL language exams. But I was there when the first refugee doctor who was from Afghanistan qualified, and it was passed his PLAB 2 and got his first job. And of course, many of the migrants want to stay in Middlesbrough. They want to stay in North Tees because that's the area that's helped them. And actually, North Tees and Middlesbrough have a problem recruiting doctors in that area. So they have a stock of ready-made doctors raring to go, and it's just giving them that leg up, just helping them through, because they want to work there.
Thank you. That's really inspiring. I just found a quote which I actually made a note of in advance of this session, that links back to one of the previous questions. It's on page 90, and it's really about concern, but also perspectives on the global situation. And I think the question around people are always going to be crossing borders, and it's the optician attempted a smile. He wasn't stupid. He knew that Europe couldn't possibly welcome every single person who fancied a better life for himself, but there had to be some alternative to this mess. He knew from his internet research that most Eritreans who arrived in Europe were automatically granted asylum. Abject poverty, years of war, and a military dictatorship were hard for any EU country to argue against. So why make them go through this treacherous journey then? That was a passage that really stood out. And then I think later on in the page, it says this wasn't about politics anyway. It was about humanitarianism. It was about anticipating the desperate hands in the water and acting before they got there. And I think that's a great metaphor for individual responses, for collective national responses and international responses. So yeah, that was a great passage for me. Unless there are any more questions, and I can't see any, none have come in for a little while. I wondered if you had any final thoughts you wanted to share, Emma-Jane, and if not, then or if you do, go for it, and if not, then I'll hand over to Thomas or Anna to come next.
No, I think I've probably gone on long enough. I'm just very grateful for everybody for listening, and it's lovely, isn't it, to end on that positive note about the refugee doctors as well. Please do get in touch with Binny, who's an absolutely tremendous chap, an Eritrean himself, and I wish you all the best to your wife as well. Thank you for that last question. I really hope that you can get involved.
Brilliant. Thank you. And the sad thing about not being in person is we can't do a round of applause for you, Emma-Jane, but thank you on behalf of everyone that's on the call. A truly eye-opening book supported by a powerful presentation discussion that's opened my eyes. Can't see the rest, but I think it's safe to say people have enjoyed listening to you talk about this brilliant book. So thank you very much. And I'll quietly do a clap here self-consciously by myself in my room. And if you're there, Thomas, can I hand over to you? Great.
Yeah, thank you guys. And thank you to Anna for partnering the Book Talk event with the Cardiff Amnesty Human Rights Book Club. We started it at the end of last year as a sort of outlet, essentially, for people to gain a better understanding of human rights and also have a good discussion along the way. We're open to anyone. You don't need to be a member. So if you did want to join our Cardiff Amnesty Book Club, please do get in touch. Our email is amnesty.cardiff@btinternet.com, and we cover all sorts of books and meet online, so you can come from wherever. The other thing was just to leave you with a bit of an action, if you did want to take that away with you. As Tom said, Amnesty are deeply concerned about the Nationality and Borders Bill, and this week is a bit of a week of action on refugees. So Cardiff Amnesty are asking Amnesty members and other activists in Wales and elsewhere to support the opposition to the bill this week and express your support to the right to asylum by making paper boats and sharing images of these on social media on Saturday. So that's this Saturday, the 23rd of October. You can share them with the hashtag asylum is a human right, refugees welcome, Fortress Europe kills. And if you don't have social media, please do feel free to send them to us at amnesty.cardiff@btinternet.com as well, and we'll share them on our socials. It might seem like a minor thing, but Tom will know better than anyone that with enough public support, we can really make some change. And just for me to end on saying a massive thank you to Emma, really fascinating discussion, and as has already been said, such a powerful book. Thank you for Tom for his explanation of what Amnesty does with refugees as well, and sharing that Q&A. And a massive thank you to Anna, Emma, and also my colleague at Cardiff Amnesty, Owen Collins, for helping set this up as well. So thanks for joining, guys.
Just coming in to say thank you so much to especially Emma-Jane for such a powerful reading and talk about her book, and then a really, really important and interesting conversation between Emma-Jane and Tom. Thank you everyone for coming and listening tonight, and thank you, Thomas, also for mentioning the Cardiff Amnesty Human Rights Book Club there at the end. So this is the end of the event now. I will just mention that if you enjoyed this Cardiff Book Talk, we are running about a month of these events for the next year up until kind of mid 2022 online. So wherever you are, you can join us. The next ones coming up in November is an event on Graham Greene's novel, The Power and the Glory. And then in December, we have a special event on the recent film, The Green Knight, which just came out, and its source text, the medieval poem, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So if you go to cardiffbooktalk.org, you can find all the information there about how to book for other events, and do send us feedback if you have any. Thank you so much for listening, and good night.